My name is Uyeda, and I'm the director of Homemade Modern, where we publish DIY instructionals for how to build your own furniture. I find design inspiration by thinking about the concepts behind things and not just the expected physical outcome. And I'm going to show you how fun and easy it is to make your own furniture. We're going to experiment with our drill to see if we can come up with novel and whimsical ways to open and close cabinets. And you might think that, well, a cabinet is defined by a door that swings open. But really, the hinge in a swinging door is just one answer to the idea of a box that opens and closes. So the great thing about building your own furniture is that it doesn't have to look like everybody else's. So we're going to make an interesting piece, and it's sort of going to be in between a dresser, nightstand, and side table. GHTV, genius ideas made easy. So here's what you'll need to get started. We're going to use a 2x12, a couple 2x3s. Now 2x3s, because the wood's smaller, they tend to crack a little bit, so I like to get a little bit extra, but 2 should be plenty. We're also going to use a 2x10. We're also going to use a 1/2 inch dowel and a 1 inch dowel, and you're going to need something stretchy, some rubber bands, and in this case, I think I found like an old elastic hairband I think will be an interesting piece to use. So let's get started. So the first step for this piece is to cut the wood. So I'm going to put this 2x12 up on blocks so that our circular saw blade doesn't hit the floor. And as always, I'm going to check and make sure that the saw blade is at the right depth. Looks good. So I'm going to measure out 24 inches. Make a mark. And draw a straight line across with my speed square. So to make sure that my cuts are straight, I'm going to clamp the speed square down to the board so that I can use it as a guide. So I'm going to line up the saw blade and clamp it into place. And as always, be sure to wear safety glasses. So I'm going to take the first 24-inch piece and use it to measure out the second 24-inch piece. So I'll just line it up. So when I pick out construction lumber, 2x12s, 2x4s, 2x6s, etc., I always try to find pieces that are as straight as possible, that don't have major chunks taken out of them, and clamp down the speed square to use as a guide. And I'm going to check to make sure they're the same size. Good. Next, I'm going to cut the side pieces, and they're going to be 23.5 inches long. And I'm going to need 2 of them as well. To draw a line across the board. Clamp down the square. And again, we're going to use one piece to measure the other. So line up the ends. Draw a straight line. We're going to line up the saw blade with the pencil line. And then clamp down the speed square. And let's check to make sure they're the same length. Perfect. So next we're going to cut the shelf out of a piece of 2x10. We're going to cut that 21 inches long. Draw a line across the board. And clamp down the speed square to use as a guide. Next, we're going to cut 4 sections of 2x3. We're going to cut these to be 20 1/2 of an inch long. And we don't need to use the speed square for these because it's such a short cut that it's easy enough to do it by hand. We're going to use these pieces to make an interesting style, sort of like a timbre style door for this cabinet. So I'm using the first piece to measure the other pieces. And we'll use one side piece to measure the other. Perfect. Now that all our pieces are cut, let's start sanding. So our next step is to sand all the pieces. We're going to start first with the cabinet pieces, and we're going to sand both sides and the edges as well. We're going to start with 80 grit sandpaper and then finish with 220. Now 80 grit means that it has 80 grains of sand per square inch of paper. 220 means it has 220 grit pieces of sand. The lower the number, the rougher the sandpaper and the fastest it's going to sand down the wood. And we're going to use an orbital sander. This is a great time-saving device. You could do this by hand, but it would take a long time. And all we have to do is just take these pads and they Velcro right on. Now we want to make sure we line up the holes on the pads and the sanders. Those holes allow the sawdust to flow through the machine and into the bag. All right, let's get started. Okay, that's good for the 80 grit paper. Let's switch out to the 220. Line up the holes. Nice and smooth. So the cabinet pieces are done. Now we're going to work on the smaller pieces. So for this, we're going to start again with the 80 grit, but we're really going to work on the edges of this to sort of round everything down a little bit. You don't really need to push too hard on this tool. You just need to guide it and then let the weight of the tool do the work for you. So now I'm going to switch to the 220 to smooth it out a little bit. There we go. So in about 15 minutes of sanding, I transformed the really rough piece of 2x3 into a smooth, nice object. It's going to be part of a really cool piece of furniture. That's it for sanding. Everything's done, nice and smooth. Let's put this thing together. So now that we're done sanding, we're going to start assembling the dresser face. So to do that, we're going to have to drill some holes and then string these elastic bands through it. So let's just cut this band. There we go. And we've got a nice stretchy cord. So because we're going to thread this through this, we have to drill a hole all the way through these pieces. And we're going to use a drill bit, a 1/4 inch diameter drill bit. So we're going to put the drill bit in the drill, tighten it, and make sure that the bit is long enough to go all the way through the board. Now, when you drill all the way through something, you want to be careful not to ruin the surface of whatever you're working on. So we put a piece of scrap wood underneath the piece that we're drilling. So we're going to measure in 4 inches from each side. Line up the drill, and now we're going to drill all the way through the board. Yep, all the way through. Now sometimes the drill bit can get a little bit clogged. Didn't in that case, but it's not a bad idea just to pull up a little bit when you're about halfway through the hole. So we eased out, cleared the bit, and that'll make drilling a little bit easier for the rest of the distance. Yep, all the way through. We're going to repeat this step for each of the 4 pieces for the drawer face. Good. So now we'll move on to assembling the cabinet. We got to drill a hole through both of these, and that's going to create a pivot where the dowel's going to go through for this to sort of swing. So I have my 2 side pieces stacked up. I'm going to measure to the center. I use my speed square to measure in from the edge about 3/4 of an inch. And that's where I'm going to drill a 1/2 inch hole. So I'm going to switch my drill bits, a 1/2 inch drill bit. I'm going to check to make sure my boards are lined up. Looks good, nice and even. And I'm going to drill through both pieces. So I made it through the first piece. Nope, not quite through the second. There we go. So let's test fit to see if the dowel fits through. Good. So next up, we're going to take one of the 2x3s, and we're going to drill a 1/2 inch hole, only about 1 inch deep, right in the center of it. So let's measure it. So we're going to try to find a center. Remember, we already sanded these down a bit, so they're probably a little bit smaller than their original dimension. Looks good. And we're just going to drill about 1 inch in. So put the point on the center. Easier said than done. There we go. Good. And we'll do the same thing on the other side. Now we're going to assemble the cabinet. So I got the two side pieces, and we're going to start first by screwing on the top. I'm going to use right angle clamps to make this a little bit easier. And go to the other end, do the same thing. Double check to make sure everything's aligned. Good. And before I screw it together, I'm going to check to make sure that my middle shelf still fits in. Good. I'm going to take out the drill bit and switch to a driver bit so that I can screw this thing together. I'll be screwing it together with 2.5-inch long screws. So now that I have the first two screws in, I can take off the clamps. And put in the bottom screws. And now I'm going to screw on the bottom. So this piece is moving on me a little bit, so I'm going to use the right angle clamp to put it into the proper position. All right, now it's locked into place. This will make screwing it together a little bit easier. There we go. All right, so we have the frame assembled. Now we got to screw in the middle shelf. And we want to make sure that the holes we drilled through the side pieces are facing up. And that the middle shelf, which is cut from the 2x10, is going all the way to the bottom. So we're going to measure 11 inches up. And from the top. And our shelf is going to go right in between those two marks. We're going to measure 11 inches from the top and 11 inches from the bottom. So that our shelf will go right in between those marks. Now I'm just going to extend those lines with the speed square. To Just draw a line across the board. Perfect. So I'm going to measure from just the edge of the side piece, 11 3/4 of an inch down, and that'll give me the center line of where the middle shelf should be. And I'm going to screw right along that center line. Checking to make sure that my shelf is in place. And let's do the same thing on the other side. Let's measure 11 3/4. So I'm just going to check to make sure the shelf is level. Then drive in an additional screw to fix it into place. And once I have the board lined up, I'll apply a little pressure and drive a screw through it. All right. And now we have a shelf. So next up, we're going to drill some holes through the top and bottom so that we have a place to latch the door that will open and close. We're going to use a 3/4 inch drill bit. And we want these holes to line up with the holes in the 2x3 pieces that we drilled. Mark them. And we'll want the center of these holes about 1.25 inches in from the edges. So because this is kind of high up, you won't really have your weight behind the drill, so I'm going to go ahead and set this on the floor to make it a little bit easier. So I'm going to line up the point of the drill with the mark. And drill through. I'm going to flip it over and do the same thing to the bottom. And I'm just making a mark 1.25 inches in from the edge. Lining up the point of the drill. My mark is aligned right with a knot in the wood. Now knots are generally much harder than the surrounding wood, so this might move around a little bit and could get a little bit tricky. Yeah, worked out well. Flip it over so that the front is facing up. I'm just going to mark from the center of the hole out to the edge on all the holes. my circular saw. And I want to cut a groove that connects the outside to the hole that I just drilled. So before I plug in the saw, I'm going to adjust the saw blade. So that the blade just comes down to just before the center of the hole. There we go. Now that my blade is adjusted on my saw, I can plug it in, line it up along the pencil marks. There we go. So now I have a groove that goes right through to the hole, but I want to make sure that my elastic cord is going to fit through that. Now we're going to start assembling the drawer face. So what I want to do is to take this first piece of 2x3 that we drilled holes in either ends of and put the dowels through the outside of the side panels and into the ends of the 2x3. So what we're going to want to do is cut pieces of the dowel that are about 3 inches. So I'm going to measure 3 inches. And one more 3-inch piece. So now we're going to see if we can peg this into place. So it's kind of a tight fit, which isn't a bad thing. So we'll just grab a little block of wood or a hammer to nudge it along. One peg in. Actually, a block of wood sometimes works better than a hammer because it's softer, and if you miss and hit the wood, you won't dent it as much. So now we created a piece that can rotate freely, or let's cut some short pieces of the 1-inch dowel. So with the 1-inch dowel, we're going to measure out 4 inches and cut 2 pieces. So these are going to be the 2 pieces that we use as handles to latch the door into position. But in order to do so, we're going to have to drill some holes in them. So since we're drilling through them all the way, we're going to use a scrap piece of board underneath us. I'm going to aim for the center, put the point in. And drill through. Now that I got my pivoting piece in place, I can string up the rest of the door. Now don't worry if it's a little bit hard to turn at first. With use, it'll smooth out and become easier and easier. I'm going to string this elastic cord through the hole, but I don't want to go all the way through, so I'm going to tie a knot in it. So we just need a knot that's big enough so that when I string it through, it'll stop at this size of a hole, which is 1/4 inch in diameter. So that looks big enough. Let's try it. So we'll string this through, turn it so we can pull it through. There we go. And it works. But now I have an issue where this kind of ugly knot is showing. So I'm going to drill a 1/2 inch diameter hole just about 1/2 inch deep so that the knot will be hidden inside that bigger hole. So pull out the string. Get my drill with a 1/2-inch bit. I'm going to line it up right on the 1/4-inch diameter hole and just drill down a little bit. Let's clean it out a little bit. That should be good enough. Now let's see if this works. Get the sawdust out. So push it through. And now we can hide the knot, and the whole thing will rotate all the way around. And we'll just trim the end of this cord. Let's try that again. So feed it through. And there we go. So now we have the stopping power of the knot, but it's invisible. But first, we got to do the other side. Just going to use a screw to scrape out the dust in the hole. So push it through. There we go. Okay, so now we can start stringing on the 2x3 pieces. And after each piece, we want to tie a couple knots, but with not too much tension. This will keep the pieces from falling off while we string the rest of them on. So this isn't usual woodworking, but what's the point of making things if you could buy the exact same version? Okay, let's do the next piece. Just scrape out the dust in the hole. So I'm just going to make a series of knots after I string on each piece so that when it sort of falls and wobbles, they don't all come unstrung. Yeah. So we'll string this through, turn it so we can pull it through. I'm using an elastic cord from a hairband. But rubber bands, surgical tubing, or anything that's pretty much stretchy and stringy will work. So push it through. Good. So I'm just going to trim the end so it makes it a little bit easier to thread through. Okay, just one more piece to do before the handles. So now I'm going to go ahead and put the handle on this side. And tie one last series of knots after this handle. Okay, so now the handle's on. One side's done. So if you're having having trouble threading them through, you can take some wire, bend it around it, then thread the wire through. That way you can pull it right through. Yay, look at how easy that is. And let's put on the last handle. All right, it's all strung on. Let's flip it over and see how it works. So we'll grab the two handles, latch them in place, and ta-da! You know, it's really nice. Furniture doesn't have to be boring. It can be whimsical and creative, and you can try things that are, well, that you haven't seen before. The other cool thing about this is that we don't have to actually use hardware or hinges, which tend to add cost to a project. But we do need to figure out a way to lift it up a little bit and put some legs on it so that we can latch the bottom as well. So now I'm going to cut some legs out of a piece of 2x3. I want them to just be a little bit shorter, so I'm just going to eyeball it. And again, since this is just a short piece of wood, I really don't need to use the speed square. And I'm just going to use one piece to measure the other. I'm going to quickly sand the rough parts of the legs. Now I'm going to screw the legs in place. So I want to make sure that the legs are positioned so that the handles won't bump into them. Okay, that should do it. And I'm just going to use 2.5-inch screws through the 2x3s and into the cabinet. Go. I'm also going to trim these strings. And flip it over and get it ready for staining. I think we'll use a nice ebony finish. So a great way to hide all the flaws and imperfections in your woodworking is to use a stain or paint that covers them up. So we're going to use a ebony stain by Minwax. We're going to do one coat of it, and we're going to see how this comes out. So I'm just going to apply it with a foam brush. And the difference between a stain and a paint is that the stain will still show some of the wood grain through it. Once the stain is dry, you could add a clear coat finish on top of it for further protection, but I think this is probably going to end up as a nightstand, so don't really think that's super important. Also, I don't really like it when wood feels like plastic. And sure, I mean, it could get nicked or stained, but even if you spilled something as dark as red wine on it, it's probably not going to show up that much on top of the black. And dents are part of are sort of proof of authenticity. If you dent something that's a wood laminate over particle board, you see the sort of artificial nature of it exposed. With solid wood, when it's dented or scratched, you see that it's wood all the way through. And that's kind of nice. So you also notice that when you are staining the end grain, it soaks up a lot more of the stain. It's almost like a stick of celery cut in half. Just absorbs up any moisture. The other nice thing about this stain is that the colors of the 2x3s and the 2x12s were a little bit different. And the stain will sort of make them more similar. It'll also hide the screw heads, which are black. The way things open and close or operate can be a really cool function to innovate on. So I remember as a kid, I always thought Lamborghinis were so cool because the doors open differently than a normal car. So making a cabinet, even if it's with a beginner level skill that opens differently, will probably get people to remember it. I've also always liked the way wood looks in stacks. And this sort of operable door kind of looks like a stack of 2x3s. But then because it has the elastic cords, it kind of moves almost more like a piece of fabric. And it takes a really long time to become a master woodworker. So trying to compete or trying to make something as good as the experts can be really frustrating. But you can always make something different that's all your own. Feel free to be innovative. Experiment, try things a little bit differently. And sometimes it's good not to wait until you have everything figured out, but sort of think your way through the problem. A lot of the things I've made too haven't really worked out exactly the way I wanted them to. The first time I tried making concrete furniture, I ended up with a mess that weighed about 240 pounds, which I then had to move out of my third floor walk-up apartment. So it's kind of like CrossFit, but dirtier. So sometimes when you first put on a stain, you think that you don't like it. But it's always good to test it out on a scrap piece first and actually let it dry. Because even though this looks really black right now, I have a feeling it's going to lighten up a little bit as it dries. So I'm going to go ahead and finish painting this all around. It's going to take a little bit because there's a lot of little nooks and crannies and I got to get in between all the 2x3s, but pretty excited with how it's coming out. It might have been a little bit easier, or a lot easier, to stain all the pieces before we assembled it and then just touch it up. But sometimes I like to see what the piece looks like before I pick the color of the finish. So I'm going to cut a strip of rag because I'm having trouble getting some stain into the holes that I drilled because the brush won't fit. So I'm going to dip a little bit of rag in the stain and see if I can thread it through. And then floss the hole. Now, these aren't the ideal rags because you can see they're leaving a little bit of lint on things, but we'll just make sure that we wipe that off. So now that most of it's done, let's flip it over and stain the legs. It's looking pretty good. I'm going to wipe off any excess stain, and then I'm going to have to let it dry a couple hours. Each stain behaves a little bit differently, so always check the manufacturer's label to get their recommendations. So as it dries and I rub off the excess, the wood grain's really starting to come through, which is what we wanted. It looks really good. Well, I'm going to let it dry a couple hours before we move it, and yeah, I'm very happy. So the stain's dry. Let's see how it opens and closes. Oh, look at that. It works. I'm really happy with how it came out. You can't really go out and just buy something like this, and that's one of the fun things about making your own things, is you can get something that's unique. I like the way the door opens. It's whimsical, it's creative, and it could look great in any room. So this project, I really wasn't sure how it was going to come out. I sort of thought my way through it. And that's a common thing with design and making. Even if you have perfect instructions, there's always going to be little unexpected bumps along the way. The wood could be crooked, could be gouged, and the key is just to keep going, adjust, remember the skills that you learned already, like cutting, learning how to line things up, drilling, sanding, and just keep tinkering with it until you get it to work the way you want.